If you've ever driven around France, you'll be familiar with the tolls along the highways. You drive up to the barrier, most are automated these days, you pay your money and off you go. There's this one in northern France at a place called Ancarville in Normandy. It's about 30 kilometres from Rouen. On Tuesday the 14th of May, a prison van transferring a prisoner from Rouen to a prison in Leroux. This toll is about halfway there. The van and its support vehicle, blue lights flashing, make their way through the barrier, and then suddenly a black SUV, driving the wrong direction, heads straight towards the van and crashes into it. Now they're trapped between the barrier and the SUV. From somewhere behind the support vehicle and from inside the black SUV, 4 gunmen dressed in black and armed with assault rifles get out and start firing on the guards, who are only armed with pistols. 2 prison officers were killed, the first to die in the line of duty in over 30 years. 3 others were wounded. Then you see the side of the prison van open and a man jump out. Despite the grainy CCTV footage, this person is quite noticeable as he is the only one wearing white shoes. Everyone else is head to toe in black. There's a small explosion at the front of the prison van, and then the men in black and the man with the white shoes run back through the barrier and off. This brazen and extremely violent attack happened in broad daylight. So who was this man freed from the back of the prison van? His name was Mohamed Amra. Welcome to Deep Dive from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm Jack Megan-Vickers. And this is Mohamed Amra and the drug gangs of Marseille.
Teenagers are regularly recruited on sophisticated Telegram channels that offer accommodation, food and transport.
30-year-old Mohamed Amra, a convicted local burglar. But he was also the suspect in a fatal kidnapping in the southern city of Marseille, which is facing an onslaught of gang violence.
The attack and the escape is done by a professional team. That's so meticulously planned, organised and executed.
Just after midnight, a group wearing masks forced a 27-year-old man into the back of a car in the 4th district of Marseille. A few hours later, the car was found in flames, the man dead inside. It appears to be just the latest episode of drug-related violence in the city.
Well, obviously people were shocked to begin with, shocked by the violence of this attack, which cost the lives of 2 prison officers. Shocked too at the extent to which organised crime is now visibly active in perhaps less expected areas of the country.
This is Iris Oustinoff Leroux, an analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime.
Given that until now, in the minds of most French citizens, activities leading to, that kind of violence were more likely to be found in so-called high crime environments like Marseille and the Paris suburbs, Normandy is a region with a fairly calm reputation. So it's understandable that this case is also causing generalized concern about the spread of violence. The French media covered the story in the context of a somewhat fragile political climate at a time when the precariousness of a penitentiary system that's, lacking both financial and human resources, not to mention prison overcrowding, had been talked about for some time. A few days after the attack, actually, tapping of Amra's cell revealed the facilities he had access to through his network. That included numerous mobile phones, shishas, delivery food, and drugs, most likely cannabis, without being detected. So inevitably, blame was placed on the government, for sure.
After the vicious attack, which left 2 prison officers dead, the French Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, said they will pay for what they've done. But it's hard to remove the image of the luxuries that Amra had inside prison: takeaway food, multiple cell phones, shisha, all while serving time. Amra was able to continue his criminal activities from inside prison. The only reason we know about this is because police suspected him of being involved in a murder in Marseille, so they bugged his prison cell. According to French news outlet BFM TV, he communicated with his network from prison through Signal, the encrypted messaging app, including attempting to buy automatic weapons at €6,000 each. But saying all this, Amra was considered a fairly medium-level criminal, not a person running a huge cartel or mafia group. And that is partly why there is so much shock around his escape, because the level of violence used to free him is so extreme.
He was, though, not exactly recognized or considered to be a drug lord or a prominent figure in organized crime in France. And yet, he is now France's most wanted man, and even Interpol has issued a red notice on him. So what emerges from the information that has come to light, as this case it's ongoing, it hasn't been resolved yet, is that Amra is an extremely tough, threatening, violent man who really doesn't hesitate to be equally violent towards the members of his network. He seems to be someone with enough influence, we know now, to organize kidnappings, manage his trafficking, and even order weapons from his cell. What's certain at this stage, and from an organized crime point of view, is that Amra is valuable enough to assume this kind of risk, since we're talking here about a very serious possibility of life imprisonment for the people responsible for this attack once they're found.
So let's talk a little bit about Mohamed Amra, aka La Mouche, which means the fly. As we heard at the start, Amra was being transported from one prison to another where he was serving an 18-month sentence for burglary. He had 13 previous convictions. But he's also suspected of being involved in an attempted assassination of a former business partner who was shot with an automatic weapon in Marbella in Spain in 2023. The gunman fled and the burnt-out escape vehicle caused a forest fire. Although Amra hasn't been formally charged for that crime, 2 people were gunned down with Kalashnikovs in Leroux, Normandy a month later in an alleged retaliatory attack. According to his lawyer, Amra had been caught trying to saw through the bars of his prison cell just days before his escape. But it wasn't until the shocking events in May when Amra was freed from the prison van that the spotlight again focused in on the dramatic increase in gang violence over the last few years in France. And the city that has been at the forefront of this is Marseille, on the Mediterranean coast, France's second most populous city, a city that Mohamed Amra is familiar with. Marseille has for a long time been an important node in international drug trafficking. During the mid-20th century, the so-called Corsican Mafia had a presence here. You may have heard of the infamous French Connection, at one time the world's largest heroin trafficking network. It was run out of Marseille. Indeed, the Corsican Mafia clans are still a significant force in European organised crime. But today in Marseille, the Corsican Mafia clans have been replaced by what has become known as narco-banditisme. One Marseille police officer told Le Parisien news outlet that the level of violence based on vendetta is reminiscent of their Corsican predecessors. These new gangs with names like DZ Mafia and the Yoda Gang, Les Olivers A, are based in the surrounding suburbs of Marseille, the arrondissement, and it's these drug gangs who operate in and around the large tower blocks who are driving the extreme levels of violence. In France, the use of automatic weapons such as Kalashnikovs has risen in recent years. In places like Marseille, where Amra was suspected of involvement in criminal activity, this city has long had problems with gang violence, as gangs like Yoda and the DZ Mafia compete over lucrative illicit drug markets. In 2023, 120 people were injured in drug-related violence, 49 were killed. That's over a 50% increase on the year before. Many of the violent incidents in the city saw Kalashnikovs being used, including by children. And so, putting the attack on the prison van holding Amra into a wider context, yes, it was incredibly violent and committed in a place where this is not the norm. But all it takes is a quick look at what's happening in places like Marseille for you to realise that the vicious levels of drug violence we're now seeing in France and Western Europe more broadly is at levels of brutality unheard of in the recent history of the continent. Bodies hacked to pieces on videos and then that video being sent to the family of the victim. Children riddled with bullets as they're caught in the crossfire of warring gangs. And then something called a Marseille barbecue, which is when someone is burnt alive inside a vehicle. Indeed, it was one of these Marseille barbecue murders that police were investigating whilst Amra was in prison, as they suspected his involvement. The violence that we've seen in Marseille and the violence of the attack on the prison van carrying Mohamed Amra, directly targeting prison officers, has caused real concern in French society.
In the public mind, drug trafficking is one of the first illicit activities that comes to mind when people think of organized crime. It's nurtured by the daily news in the country and also by popular culture, obviously. Last year already, organizations like the OFAST and the OFDT warned of the unprecedented wave of violence that accompanied drug trafficking activities, with a 57% increase in homicides and attempted homicides compared to 2022. So it would seem that we're now faced with criminal actors who demonstrate a desire to be violent and even to kill in order to eliminate competitors or actually anyone who interferes with their objectives. This is a rather new phenomenon and one that should be dealt, obviously, with caution. And this was actually clearly demonstrated in the attack we're looking at here, where the attackers, the assailants, did not hesitate to shoot at prison guards in cold blood, and these guys were admittedly less heavily armed. And although in this particular case a number of secondary reasons have been put forward, including a lack of experience on the part of the attackers, there are many examples today of methods and modus operandi that involve particularly high levels of violence. So much so that we now speak of narco-homicides in France. For drug traffickers, it seems that violence is no longer confined, to the settling of scores among kingpins, but has indeed become a tool used by traffickers at all levels. That's including intermediaries, henchmen, jobbers, etc. Even if this means that collateral victims may be local population themselves, and that this violence is now being added to a strategy of terror to reinforce that very important territorial control.
Indeed, in 2023, there was this one story from Nantes, a city in the west of France, just away from the Atlantic coast. Drug traffickers looking to collect on an €8,000 debt broke into an apartment where they held those inside hostage, raping two and torturing the others to get the money. Another story from Marseille told how a gang kidnapped and tortured the owner of a local pizzeria just 50 meters from a deal point because he talked too much, eventually forcing him to sell his business for less than it was worth. Let's take a look at the 13th arrondissement, which is one of the most profitable drug dealing spots in the city, and home to a couple of the gangs that fought one another, including the one that Mohamed Amra is allegedly involved with, known as Les Blacks. According to figures analysed by Le Figaro, between 2019 and 2021, the rival of the Blacks, called Olivier A, were making around €50,000 a day in the 13th arrondissement, selling cannabis, cocaine and synthetic drugs. The Blacks have been locked in a fierce battle with Olivier A from a neighbouring estate since 2021, when violence erupted over the summer months. Now, these estates are right next to each other, with big white apartment blocks and a maze of streets, and it was at the foot of a building in Hirondelle Estate where two masked men dressed in black opened fire with Kalashnikovs on a group of 5 or 6 young people. The attackers fled back to Les Olivers estate, which is less than a 10-minute walk away. Over the summer, 7 people were gunned down by rival gang members armed with Kalashnikovs, a weapon that has become synonymous with the violence in Marseille. The 2 shooters who started it all, Elamine Shahabdin and Saddam Yusuf, were arrested and jailed for the attack in January this year. The prosecutors said that they were both traffickers from Olivier's A in high positions. Shahabdin was indicted for the murder of a man in Martigues, around 35 kilometers from Marseille. The victim was originally from the Lauriers district in Marseille.
There's a link between the intensification of violence and competition over the control of drug markets, which means urban territories. And this is a well-known pattern we see in many countries, also within Europe. At the same time, violence serves as a mean to deter, law enforcement interventions and the cooperation of the communities with authorities. And so public killings, burning a victim in a car, is not about settling a conflict, but rather about creating a reputation and therefore dissuading competitors and authorities. So much of the violence that we see now in France applies to the vision of an urban territory that must be controlled by all means, and in some cases, ideally expanded, with maximum deterrence for law enforcement agencies and outside networks that might otherwise attempt to disrupt that equation. The authorities involved in combating organized crime in France, and more specifically drug trafficking, agree on this point. The climate of hyper-violence or ultra-violence that reached record levels last year, particularly in the Marseille neighborhoods, is mainly due to the trivialization of violent acts that's brought about by the increase in settling of scores in particular. And we're now seeing intimidation techniques such as kneecapping, which involves shooting the target in the legs. It's now more frequently used than in the past. So this whole dynamic of control through fear and force, it's used to take place in the most sensitive neighborhoods. And it seems now to have led to a readiness to draw one's weapon that didn't exist before.
Within the neighbourhoods, the gangs block off access to the estates they operate. This way, if law enforcement is on the way, they have time to hide their drugs, money, and anything else incriminating. So you have spotters, some of them are children, stationed at the entrances to the estate or on the top of apartment blocks, so that they can report the comings and goings for a small daily fee of around 60 to 120 euros. The dealers will make around 200 to 300 euros a day, and then you have the guy who manages the spot. Graffiti placed around the estate or dealing spot, as well as on online platforms like Telegram and TikTok, display the drugs on offer and the price. Dealing points can generate at least 25,000 euros a day, some as high as 90,000. That's millions a month. According to some estimates, combined, the drug gangs bring in over 30 million euros every month. Beyond Marseille, drug trafficking is estimated to generate 3 to 6 billion euros every year in France. Now, what's interesting is that research has shown that there has been a diversification in illicit drugs. Not just the type of substance, but also the routes used to get them into the country.
There's been a marked increase in cocaine imports to France and basically to Europe. The last few years have also seen a diversification of synthetic drugs in particular, and this has had repercussions on users who are increasingly growing in number and coming from a wider range of settings than in the past. Diversity also in hotspots for the actual trafficking of these drugs. GI-TOC research has shown that it's no longer just the major ports in France and neighboring countries such as, Marseille, Le Havre, Antwerp, that are used to ship supplies, but also increasingly small fishing ports and marinas. In the same vein, and as the Senate report confirms, drug users and traffickers are no longer to be found mainly in large cities, but now also in rural areas that used to be much more sparsely supplied, but where there's now a dynamic of even delivery routes that contributes to the Uberization of drug trafficking.
So when I spoke to Iris about this, for those in the UK, it reminded me of the so-called county lines gangs. These are dedicated phone lines that supply illicit drugs distributed from the larger cities out to the smaller towns and rural communities, often moved by children or vulnerable adults who've been coerced or exploited into it by the gangs. Now, back in France, the roles at the dealing spots are often filled by kids or very young adults, groomed by the promise of wealth. And like we've seen in other parts of the world, gangs use social media to recruit kids into their ranks. We had an episode called Colombia in the Face of Crime and Violence, which talked about this, and it's no different on these estates in France.
So these young people are also the ideal workforce for traffickers, as they are criminally responsible under the age of 14 years old in France. And many of these kids are as young as 9 or 10. They have little to no family ties, they live in precarious situations, and they're desperate for recognition from their peers. And as they get older, there are teenagers having grown up in a rather unsettled climate, and given that the employment rate for people aged 15 to 24 years old in France was over 18% in the first quarter of 2024, in comparison, that of Europe was, for the same period, was 14.8%. This is golden bread for criminal groups. And the argument that currently dominates this debate is that networks will recruit younger individuals, often with a purely opportunistic aim of having a small, easily manipulated workforce right, at hand at their disposal. And at the same time, they are benefiting from a much wider reach in a municipality, a département, or a district, if you will, and sometimes even an entire region. The Marseille public prosecutor was already describing the situation actually in 2022. And she was saying that traffickers would broadcast videos via these networks, featuring teenagers with bundles of cash, describing what the job entails, and thus luring their audience into believing that this is the perfect opportunity to make serious money easily, get a status, etc., etc.
There was another story of a kid just 16 years old who arrived in Marseille to sell drugs. He tried selling in a place where he needed authorization from the drug gang to do so. He was subsequently captured, beaten, taken to an abandoned room where he was tied to a chair naked and repeatedly beaten and burnt with cigarettes, and then a blowtorch. President Macron described the kids getting involved with the gangs as like a lark mirror, which is a really old wooden hunting tool with bits of mirror glass attached, helping to attract and catch larks. In France, this term has come to mean an illusion. And fundamentally, that's what much of social media is, but it can be used for other reasons. For example, there was this one assassin known as Mathieu F. Listen to this video of him boasting about his work.
Ouais, frérot, cache, t'as vu là, je vais enchaîner les contrats, frérot, je vais redescendre, le soir je vais remonter à Paname, ça va tout baiser, ça. Sur la vie de ma mère, tu vas te jurer, mon sang, sur la vie de ma mère, tu vas péter un plomb.
He's talking about all of the contracts he's had and that he's having a laugh whilst carrying out his deadly duties. Mathieu F was just 18 years old and known to have committed 3 murders, a 15, 16 and a 20-year-old. He's also suspected of involvement in another 6 or 7. He was arrested in April 2023 and he told law enforcement that he'd earned around 200,000 euros from his work.
More and more young people are involved in these networks, and we're talking here about a generation of hyper-connected young people with very easy access to graphic violence circulating on the internet, a need to assert their legitimacy, and the influence of a general tightening of the methods used by traffickers.
And Mathieu F was apparently from a middle-class family and was recruited through social media. According to a public prosecutor in Marseille, the majority of perpetrators are aged between 16 and 21, like Mathieu F. He was asked to film his hits and upload them to social media, and the more coverage he would get, the more he would get paid. The more likes on Instagram, the higher the price. Why? Because for the gangs, it's a show of force to their rivals.
The reality on the field has its darker side. It's actually quite a dark aspect of the system. As it turns out, networks used for recruitment campaigns are also sometimes used as a tool for intimidation. And we see that sometimes those networks are actually forcing young people to join or pressuring those who might wish to leave and keep them in check, through extremely violent simulated acts, which are again conveyed via those social networks. So this use of social network is both a way for them to attract easily manageable work hand, but also to pressure them and to actually keep them in their networks because they are very convenient. It's actually a quite difficult and dark aspect of this business.
Now, the Kalashnikov is a favoured weapon used in many of these violent acts carried out by the drug gangs. There is major concern around the availability of arms for organised crime. The EU's European Multidisciplinary Platform Against Criminal Threats, or MPACT, has highlighted illicit firearms trafficking as one of the EU's top priorities. During the deadly assault on the prison van that freed Amra, the admittedly grainy video appears to show that the automatic weapons used by the attackers were likely Kalashnikovs or copies of them, as many states created their own versions of the AK-47 and the later AK-74. In Europe, these weapons are most likely guns left over from the Yugoslav wars during the 90s, which have made their way onto the black market. And in France they would fall under Category A, which means that they are classed as military-grade firearms, as they are fully automatic, and so prohibited for the general public except in extremely rare cases. According to the Global Organised Crime Index, the Western Balkans region scores well above average for arms trafficking compared to the rest of Europe. Indeed, back in 2015, when France suffered a shocking Islamist terrorist attack, which left over 130 dead and hundreds injured, the weapons used by the gunmen were traced back to a batch of Zastava M70 assault rifles, a Yugoslavian copy of the AK-47, and they were produced in the late 80s. The weapons used in the Islamist attack in 2015 on the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo also came from the Balkans and Eastern Europe, as did the ammunition. And in a recent study by the GI called Smoke on the Horizon, it showed that the Western Balkans is still the main source of illegal weapons in Europe. Not only are they relatively cheap and numerous, but are being supplemented by air guns, which are subsequently modified and converted to fire live rounds. In March this year, the DZ Mafia, who, as we heard, have been locked in a violent struggle against the Yoda gang, posted an image of a cache of Kalashnikovs on Snapchat and TikTok, because the battle takes place on social media as well as on the streets. Aside from Kalashnikovs, one thing relating to weapons that might be worth mentioning is 3D printed weapons. The GI's report shows that although they're still in their early stages of development, they are getting more and more sophisticated. In February this year, French prosecutors showed an FGC-9 Mark II, a semi-automatic 3D printed gun. The head of the French Gendarmerie National Cyber Unit declared the guns good to very good and 95% close to the original model. A month before this, in January this year, a 3D printed weapon was used for the first time in an attempted murder in Marseille. Finally, let's finish on the response from government. How have they tried to tackle the gangs and the violence that surrounds them? Let's start with Operation Place Net XXL, a campaign of raids targeting specific dealing spots and a huge investment in hiring extra police officers with more resources to combat the gangs. Starting in Lille in northern France, just over the border from Belgium, in March this year it was Marseille's turn. President Macron showed up and walked around the streets of La Catalane in the 15th arrondissement on the edge of Marseille, where he declared, "Drugs are our enemy." Now, it was here where just a few months earlier in November 2023, a TikTok video was released of police being attacked by gang members, including homemade weapons that were once fireworks, forcing them to fire shots to free themselves from the onslaught. For Operation Place Net, hundreds of officers were deployed in Marseille, and they retrieved weapons, ammunition, vehicles, over 1.5 million euros in cash, nearly half a ton of cannabis, and nearly 3 kilos of cocaine, and made hundreds of arrests. But according to various media outlets, there was some concern among local residents that when the police leave, the dealers will just come back, or they've just pushed them to surrounding areas, or even online where they are using encrypted messaging apps. One resident described the Place Net operation in Catalan as a sword in the water, and another resident said it was a PR stunt. Indeed, even the Senate report described the Place Net operations as limited. 473 were conducted across the country between September the 25th, 2023 and April the 12th, 2024. 50,000 gendarmerie and police officers were deployed. They seized plenty of cannabis, less than 40 kilos of cocaine, and a few million euros in cash. They argue that the so-called pilonnage operation, which targets specific areas with consistent and overwhelming police efforts, has been far more effective. In 2023, this technique led to the seizure of 425 kilograms of cocaine, 1,268 weapons, and nearly 14 million euros in criminal assets. And you could argue that the fears of the local residents has been borne out, because in July, a few months after the operation, again police officers were attacked in the 15th arrondissement with Molotov cocktails and those homemade weapons that were once fireworks, whilst trying to remove barricades from the streets. And as we heard earlier, these barricades are put in place by the gangs. And this isn't the first time police have targeted this area. Back in 2019, they demolished the Tourquay or K Tower, which was an important dealing point, reportedly making between 50 and 80,000 euros a day. But despite the demolition, the drug gangs are still there. And although it's good news to make a seizure of illicit drugs, let's take the 3 kilos of cocaine. According to the Senate report, 0.7 tons were seized in Marseille in 2021, 1.7 tons in 2022. So 3 kilos are just a drop in the ocean of what's passing through this city. That being said, the state has made progress against certain prominent gang members. For example, this year a man named Félix Bingui, the alleged head of the Yoda clan, the gang who, alongside the DZ Mafia, have caused so many deaths over the past few years. Bingui was arrested in Morocco in March and extradited to France in May. Such was the importance this arrest was given, the French Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin declared it a significant blow to drug crime thanks to our cooperation with Moroccan authorities. But despite these proclamations, the reality is that illicit drugs are highly profitable. According to that Senate report, remember that annually there were 3 to 6 billion euros in France. And when we see that Kalashnikov carrying gangs of Marseille gunning each other down, burning each other in cars, brutalising one another, despite successful operations by law enforcement, and now with this case of Mohamed Amra, a direct challenge to the state, is it any wonder that some politicians warn about the future, some using phrases like Mexicanization? Indeed, the Senate report warned of more violence and that law enforcement was overwhelmed, and that the drug traffickers' means are infinite. So the game is terribly unequal. In addition to that, corruption is a concern. For example, a mayor was arrested earlier this year for suspected drug trafficking. The case is ongoing and the person accused denies the charges. A senator called Etienne Blanc warned that France is not a narco state, but it has some of the characteristics of one, and that the government needs to wake up to the size and scope of the challenge. Now, narco state is a loaded term and sometimes isn't helpful or realistic, and in the case of France, it seems more like a political tool to make people sit up and take notice.
You know, narco state is a very blurry term and actually doesn't provide any analytical value. Just the fact that a country is host of a booming drugs economy does not necessarily mean that the government or authorities are part of it. What will convert it into something like a system one may call a narco state? But we're not there yet for France. France is certainly a country that has the means and resilience to withstand a challenge like that. And I think we have to be careful not to slide into uncontrolled or uncontrollable fear, especially at this very moment in France's history. That said, organized crime has existed actively in France and in Europe for several decades, and successive governments, in France at least, have so far drawn more on the resources of the country and partner countries to address threats related to terrorism. Now, organized crime is a different threat than terrorism. It's motivated by greed, not by political or religious drivers. And as it's often the case, organized crime, as we speak of it today, has developed gradually. And we feel it's now exploding, especially the cocaine market, because to date, this is a phenomenon that hasn't been efficiently prevented. Why? Because it's not well understood to start with. And it's unlikely that the highly violent and destabilizing criminal networks, as we have witnessed it in other countries, is a risk that will be replicated in France. That being said, we're starting to see a fairly serious trend towards a cooperation dynamic between transnational criminal networks and using increasingly violent methods to run their business. So it may be argued that the merit of the French Senate using that term of narco state is to enhance the visibility and the political weight of this challenge. And it's true, it's about time that France realizes the extent to which the problem of organized crime is no longer external.
Mohamed Amra is still on the run. There's an Interpol Red Notice out for his arrest, and French law enforcement have mobilised to find him, but so far he's eluded capture. The Senate report recommended turning OFAST, which is the Office for Narcotics, into a French version of the DEA. Also, they suggest creating a national anti-narcotics prosecutor's office and improving the overcrowded prison system, a place where criminals like Amra were able to continue to access their networks. But in the meantime, the violence continues. Not only what we saw during Mohamed Amra's escape, but also in other French cities, including Marseille, where the automatic gunfire is becoming more frequent again. At the time of recording, just the day before, 3 people were shot and injured. 3 more were killed in the previous week. Fundamentally, there is a market for these illicit drugs, and organised crime will service that market. And despite law enforcement action, unless that can be sustained for the foreseeable future, established gangs will reassert themselves over the communities, or the upstart gangs will fill the vacuum. But we can be confident that whatever the gangs do, it will be accompanied by the soundtrack of a Kalashnikov. That's it for this episode of Deep Dive. I'd like to thank Iris for speaking to us. Iris's article, France in the Crossfire, Prisoner Escapes in Normandy Amid Rising Organised Crime, is available in the summary to this episode and on our website, globalinitiative.net. This has been Deep Dive from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm Jack Megan-Vickers. Thanks for listening.